right, we'll move right on to our keynote, for which I'd like to introduce Mr. Quinn, who will be presenting the ebbing tide of networking expertise. Corey is the Chief Cloud Economist at the Duckbill Group, and he had traveled from San Francisco to join us today. This is Corey's first time presenting at NANOG, and it's a pleasure to have him speaking with us. Welcome, Corey.
Thank you. You say that in advance, but wait until I finish this. All right. Has anyone noticed lately that networking is kind of a complete mess? Just throwing that out there. For example, look at IPv6 as an example pulled completely from the ether. There are some challenges with it. For example, it's coming soon. It's been coming soon for longer than I've been in the industry. And no, it's still not here yet, but it's coming soon if we all just wait a little bit longer. The government required IPv6 back around 2010 for all of their services, and they're still not fully there yet, because why would they be? Apple has been mandating it since 2016 that any app in their app store has to work from a pure IPv6 network. So on some level, the leaders are really doing their part. It's the rest of us that are dragging our feet on that, if I'm being honest. In this context, I want to be clear that cloud providers, you're the rest of us in this moment. I know you love to call yourselves leaders, but in this case, no, you're just the biggest. You're kind of like the rest of us. This is usually the part where I would dunk on AWS specifically because of who I am and what I do, but that's not really the case. In this case, everyone's behind the curve. Google, Microsoft, all of them. So, I just want to be clear here that who I am. That's not really what the talk is about. I just felt like complaining, and since I have a microphone and you don't, you get to listen to my complaints about anything I really feel like opening my mouth and sounding off about. By day, I fix horrifying AWS bills, mostly for large companies. I'm not much of a network person, but I get to talk to a lot of people who are, and they're very, very good at what they do. And this has given me some opinions over the course of, well, the time I've been doing this. I know I don't necessarily look it, but I am old, and every time I talk to folks about networking stuff, I feel generationally older because the expertise is sort of drained out of the industry as a whole. There used to be a time when there was a very healthy business you could spin up if you had a CCNA or a CCIE or any of the CCNP mid-grade stuff, and you could contract out to startups that were setting up their own infrastructure. You could charge a couple $100 an hour, and that was decent money to get up and set up BGP peering, populate a cage, get transit, etc. But over time, that work has largely dried up because a lot of data centers started handling that for customers, at least in my experience. And startups these days just tend to start out by going to a cloud provider. I mean, if you're going out to build Twitter for pets, as a hypothetical example of a domain I totally don't own, and you're not going to be renting a cage. You're going to be signing up for an AWS account or similar. And then when you discover that the business model is inherently doomed, either because dogs don't tweet, or they do, but they're nowhere near racist enough to maintain a Twitter equivalent, you're going to shut the thing down and you'll have done it for free or 27 cents, and you're not on the hook for 18 months of data center contract. On balance, this is great unless you're the data center provider, in which case that's kind of a problem for you. Now, what startups are doing might not seem terribly relevant if you're working at a large company, like virtually everyone here that I've spoken to seems to. But if there's one thing that the corporate mind borderline fetishizes, it's in doing what startups do. And we've seen examples of this throughout history. Agile development, which was a beautiful scam, came out of the startup life. CI/CD, less of a scam, more of an aspiration we never get to. Big companies are doing it too. Even developing on Macs was very much a niche startup thing that now has gone largely mainstream. So what startups do today is what big companies are doing in 5 to 10 years. And we've seen a tremendous influx of large enterprise workloads going to cloud. This isn't particularly in debate. Now, what used to happen is that you had a stratified talent pool that at least kind of vaguely adhered to the OSI model. People who understood how to run cable, for example. People who ran this stuff who run cable aren't necessarily network engineers in the traditional sense. The person who's the cable installer probably doesn't know a whole lot about what BGP is these days. And then you wind up going down the other paths and, Okay, now you have folks who are handling the peering and the networking aspect or the VLAN segmentation, but they don't really have a lot of insight into, I don't know, different aspects of how peering works and route reconvergences. And that's a problem. And absolutely no one understands how time delay reflectometry works, because that stuff is freaking magic. And that is something that no one understands, and nothing anyone says here is going to be able to convince me otherwise. Now, the problem, as we see all of this stuff, is that there is a tremendous amount of general knowledge. This stuff is compressing down into, okay, everyone sort of assumes that you hire someone and they'll just figure this stuff out. I was a sysadmin, and it used to be that job hasn't really gone away in any meaningful sense. It's still here. Because as it plugged into the wall, it wound up being my responsibility to fix it. That's the way that it worked. And you sort of get thrown in the deep end, figure out how stuff works, and sort of hope for the best. Now, the challenge is we all got here by standing on the shoulders of giants. I mean, if you're in this room, you've made it to some degree. The question is where the next generation comes from, because the olden days of working in a help desk was great, but it's not there anymore. It's not what it used to be. I was working in a help desk. That's how I got started in this. People would call with random questions, and I mean random questions. And they had no real idea how to handle that. And okay, well, how do I fix this? Well, I don't know. I'm going to find out. That's not what a support floor is these days. It's been largely outsourced. It's been metric to absolute death. And the number one metric people care about most in support, how quickly can I get this person off the phone? The trick is, by the way, to get them to restart their computer, and you're not allowed to sit for a restart, but that's not really the point of the talk. And there is no good way that I have found out there to be able to I guess, put the stuff together. I mean, I can't fathom starting out in the networking sphere in 2024, particularly carrier-grade networking. People either get BGP or they think it's magic. I mean, you can guess which end of that spectrum I'm on. I think a looking glass is something that I look into to admire my own reflection, because my primary networking ability is wearing a suit, in case that weren't blindingly obvious to you all. Now, if I want to explore to BGP, I can't just go to a data center and ask to play with the routes. I mean, technically I can, but it doesn't tend to go super well for me when I do. Instead, I have to mock up a data center network, which means a relatively large investment in old, outdated Cisco hardware, which is kind of most of it. I mean, I'm kidding. I'm totally down to spend time on eBay bidding against Eastern Europe for all of this stuff. It builds character. It's thousands of dollars. And it's a barrier to entry. With cloud, I don't have that barrier in any meaningful sense, because instead, I just go to my local trustworthy cloud computing provider, I give a credit card, probably someone else's if I know what's good for me, and bam, I have a full VPC that's spun up for me without my having to think about it too terribly hard. And that VPC works. Mostly. You can use Terraform, or you can use CloudFormation, or you can use my personal favorite, which is using the AWS console and then lying about it, which is called ClickOps, and it's a best practice. Take that one back with you. See, there's a practical instruction set here. But we'll come back to this little guy and the challenges with VPCs. First, I want to introduce you to someone. This schlub is Steven. He's my colleague, and he's a dumbass. Fortunately, I made him up, and I'm not insulting an actual person, though at this point, if we ever hire someone named Steven, it's basically a hostile work environment by the time he finishes his onboarding paperwork. And you probably have a Steven lurking somewhere around your office, too. In the past year, I've encountered a few Stevenisms in the networking space that I'm going to share to you, because this is the closest thing I have to therapy. Anyone here know what an AWS security group is? Yeah, there's a lot of nodding out there. Good. Effectively, it's a layer 4 filter. So great. When I connect to your remote service, and then your service hangs up on me after negotiating the handshake, we already know that security groups aren't going to be the issue, since we've seen bidirectional communication. So me having to keep going back to the open support ticket for the next 3 consecutive days to reiterate that point in every iteration is kind of a problem. Please don't waste my time like that. Now, remember this guy? You should. I showed it to you 3 slides ago, about a minute back, so hopefully our memories aren't going that far. Let's unpack the glorious bullshit sandwich that is here, which is an example I've taken from a production environment. To begin, okay, we're going to give the staging the entire 10/16, which I think is kind of a weird choice, but okay. I'm not here to be religious about it. But then I went to go and figure out where production is comparatively. You folks are all network folks. If that's your staging environment, where would you put production? Shout it out. Same place. Okay, that's a good theory. Anywhere else? Oh, come on, you all can be dumber than that. But can you be this dumb? And I swear I'm not making it up. One's 10, the next one up is going to be 11. Now, the entire 11/8 is part of the Department of Defense's allocation. And while we probably don't have plans to sell to them directly this year, that might change. And if you're going to sit on someone's IP space, it seems like the other people having, a standing military is probably not the antagonist you really want to have here. Oh, and I'm not done because there's more dumbassery in here. If I wind up, okay, I've given myself an entire /16, which again, I don't own. But then I'm going to give myself a /24 in each of those. How on earth am I supposed to expand those subnets any? Now, yeah, I can take the first one and expand it out to a /23, but then I'll likely have a gateway hanging out in the middle of the range, which isn't terrific. Instead, I've got to wind up renumbering things. And in an era of ephemeral containers spinning up every which way because someone decided that was a good idea somewhere, you run out of IP space super quickly. It just feels weird. It's a lack of planning for likely future outcomes here. And this is true. I didn't make this stuff up. And my point is not to dunk on individual acts of foolishness, because honestly, I only have half an hour here. The real problem is that the companies that are responsible for doing these ridiculous, not made up stunts all needed a network engineer on the team responsible for this when there very clearly wasn't one. Because those job postings don't exist anymore. They're not there in the traditional sense. They don't really call the skill set network engineering in a lot of these companies. They call them SREs or DevOps or special engineers or God knows what. But they need network engineering so I don't spend 3 goddamn days going back and forth playing ticket tennis with a vendor on the other side of the world, taking someone to my rudimentary form of networking school just so I can get up and running. There are something like 7 times more job posts on DevOps than there are for network engineers, based on a scientific study that I attempted to conduct yesterday by checking LinkedIn on my flight out here. And once United hired a network engineer and got the website working, I pulled up some job descriptions, and I've got to say how depressing it was. This is an actual screenshot, not just something I typed into a Word document, but it's a screenshot of something someone pretty clearly typed into a Word document. The remit here is about 6 inches wide. It is a permanently low-tier role, and it's sold as network engineering. It's basically, if it plugs into the wall, you fix it. This is not the same thing anymore. You wind up in a weird space just because if you know how to splice fiber, great. Increasingly, you don't necessarily know what 802.1q tagging is, and vice versa. I had to touch all of those things when I was coming up. Not that I was good at it, but it's how I learned. And it's where growth has come from. Now, what the big companies are doing in the clouds have made all the technologists' lives here better because that bar keeps getting pushed lower. In 2024, I can get computers to talk to each other looking a lot more like this than I do like you all when it comes to networking expertise. I'm right around the high end of turtle on this scale, in case there's any lingering doubt here. I'm dumb, but I can still be effective because of the giants upon whose shoulders I'm standing. And the hyperscalers are part of the reason why. I am not here to make fun of them, believe it or not, despite the fact that I have a newsletter that makes fun of them every week. I am an old, grumpy Unix sysadmin because you've never met a young or happy one. I look like this. I'm still only 23 years old. I started with large-scale email systems. And it was pretty clear at the time that this was not going to be a sustainable long-term role because there was a lot of consolidation. It seemed like at the time that even though everyone needed an email administrator on staff at any reasonable size, that this was increasingly something that Gmails and the Microsoft 365, whatever they're calling it this week, was going to wind up eating up. So I could see the tide going out and realize it was time to go find something else to focus on. And the problem is that all of the jobs I could see that really looked like they were forward-looking required the ability to write code, which is something I wasn't particularly good at. And eventually, my sysadmin-style sandcastle got swept away. So what I'm seeing now is on the horizon the distinct end of network engineering as a clear, discrete, distinct profession. And this is not here to be doomist or alarmist. This is not going to happen tomorrow. But it is going to happen as a general industry trend in the same way that the death of the sysadmin came for me. I mean, sysadmins are still here. Most of them don't call themselves that. They call themselves SREs instead. The skill sets have changed a bit. The tools and processes, less than they would like to believe, but they make 3 times more money just by telling a story a little bit differently. And partially, it's a title shift. Like if someone wants to call you something you think is dumb, but they're going to pay you twice as much for it, well, you can call me a lot of things if you pay me enough. The skill set isn't going away. And even in networking, we've seen this before. In the dot-com bubble, you could make an easy 6 figures if you were a firewall engineer. Today, most security folks or network engineers are expected to have that skill set in their repertoire. I mean, they don't, but they're supposed to. Even the service providers themselves are struggling to find people who understand peering. I mean, that used to be something you could call into one of these big providers and talk to the person who answered the phone about it. Now it's tier 3, tier 4 senior network engineer level stuff. I mean, you call into the NOC and they ask you if you tried restarting it. You remember back in the day when you could actually call and get someone on the first ring who maybe it wasn't their direct responsibility, but they paid enough attention and cared enough and cultivated internal relationships to understand what was going on? I mean, maybe this is just nostalgia talking and I'm remembering a past that doesn't exist, but I'm pretty sure that there's something to it. And it's no better outside of the WAN or outside of carrier grade networking. It's in our corporate offices too. I mean, the help desk schlub who runs the Meraki gear, thanks for the sponsorship, by the way, of the conference, suddenly they're seeing weird route convergence and doesn't understand what it is that they're seeing. Because taking full internet tables at the edge isn't really a thing if that's your world. And so all you know is the internet is suddenly broken and it's time to shriek for help while waving your hands in the air, which was always my first approach to ask for help. It works super well if you panic loudly enough. I was this guy. I worked at the largest ISP in the state of Maine at the time, which is, talk about damning with faint praise, the Maine Schools and Libraries Network. Helped us support when I was in college for a year or so. And one summer, you know what they had me doing? Campus hub inventory. That's a hell of an internship, and it is a thankless task, but you know what I learned that summer? Basically everything about what a hub does, which is expand your collision domain as far as the eye can see. It's why we all went to switches. But you learn by doing these things. To build a data center now, even then, not only do you need technical and talented network people, but you needed talented systems people who understood networking. I helped with a data center build out one year where they wound up putting about 250 or so servers into a cage. Great. They wanted to do this high performance compute thing. And only toward the end, when I started asking questions, did I realize that no one had given a thought to top-of-rack switch congestion. So it's great as long as everything becomes very rack-aware and has some affinity knowledge programmed in, but none of the stuff they were building had even thought that that was going to be an issue. You needed people who understand these things. And it's no better in cloud. It matters there too. Amazon tells you if you ask in an incredibly overly verbose way, which is the only way to get this in a way that fits on a slide, that some instances will run at 25 gigabits per second. Great. Will it? What size packet? What's the MTU? How many packets per second? Yeah, it'll do 25 gigabit per second mostly if you tune everything right, and 12 megabit if you don't, and depending upon what other people in that environment are doing. You can get damn near line rate sometimes, but the people you're sharing resources with aren't going to be doing full line rate everywhere all the time, and you won't either. This is where non-deterministic computing is getting weird because the hardware on some level has been telling beautiful lies to us about what's really going on because it's an overlay on top of what's actually happening, and we don't get to see that. Automation is another area that I think networking has sort of been dragging its feet on in some ways. Clouds now basically automate everything. Amazon, to the best of my knowledge, please correct me if I'm wrong on this, is not sitting there hunched over a router in a data center at 3 in the morning, manually doing updates on the thing, and then moving on to the next one in the rack. These things are all programmatically built out. It's a double whammy because so much of the toil has been automated out of these things, but the toil is also where we learn. Networking is really fought against this on some ways. We don't want to automate. We don't want to automate. It's almost on some level like the taxi industry, resisting modernization at every chance it gets. And then Uber comes crashing in, says, screw you folks. And suddenly the taxi industry is on the ropes, reeling from this. you can't fight the tide of progress, and the clouds have embraced it in ways that in many ways network engineering has not. What is the current state of network engineering and automation? Because when I did it, it was a lot of rancid. Now, the magic of cloud is that I don't necessarily have to think about all the specifics of tweaking and tuning and building the things that I'm doing, because until I start pushing the boundaries of the standard box that they build for, I'm fine with it, because Amazon designed for a certain size box, and until I start reaching the boundaries of that box, I'm fine. And the box is expanding. Because no matter how clever the network engineers are at a number of modern companies, their problems, frankly, aren't that big compared to what they once were. Networking gear is cheap now, and the standard box that Amazon builds continues to expand. Bandwidth is cheap now. Let me repeat that, especially if you work for AWS. Bandwidth is cheap now. Please tell your boss that. I spend $50 a month now to get 10 gigabit Ethernet to my house. And of course it doesn't speak IPv6 yet natively. Why would it? I'm sure you've seen this before, because it's a popular sentiment that there is no cloud, it's just someone else's computer. It's also an incorrect sentiment, because in 2024, the cloud is not just a bunch of VMs sitting there. It's not even someone else's data center. I mean, you can treat it that way, but it's an expensive, foolhardy way to do it. It's a set of services and APIs that make consuming something that used to be hard to build easy. Content distribution once upon a time was very hard. Now it's an API from Cloudflare, and it's damn near free to get started with it. CPU cycles used to be expensive. So optimized code close to the hardware was important. People had to tweak assembly. Now Java is a giant, bloated, disgusting pig, but the hardware is fast enough in many cases that you can make up for it. The important part of the stack has shifted. And the internet's gotten a lot more latency tolerant as well. Traffic steering is still important, but not nearly as much as it was, because companies have gotten way better at putting shit close to where the customers are. Netflix is a case study in this. 20 years ago, streaming HD video across the internet was objectively insane, and no one except the very boldest would attempt it. Now they blazed a trail, and every third-rate video provider can do it. You can solve for yourself whatever third-rate video provider you think I'm talking about. Pick your least favorite. It's that one. Now, this has until now no doubt been a depressing talk for an awful lot of you. Let me talk to you a bit now about what I see that's the upside of this, because there is a bright future here, and I see it that way. It needs the skill set that many of you in this room have, and they don't realize it. Stuff that you have that embraces the fundamental underpinnings of all of the various expressions of technology, that stuff is there and it's important. If you're an MPLS guru, which is sort of a bit of a blast from the past, you think there's no path for you forward? Google uses label switching in their network. Please go talk to them. They would love to have more people who know what that phrase means. AI, which is eating the world at the moment, is massively network heavy because of the data requirements on it. You have an inverse data gravity, where it used to be you'd move compute close to the data. Well, only very special GPUs from a certain company that live in certain places can do this magic incorrect robot from the future thing. So you've got to move the mountain to Muhammad in this case. You have to move the data there. Massive network impact. 5G is a similar story. As everything becomes online, congestion and density, more importantly, start to become very real things once you get past the hype. If you're stuck in the 90s, great. What do you do? Well, great. So is data transfer pricing. It's like back when you had to pay per SMS pricing out there. Now I pay per connection or per session. It's like the early days of cell phones here. Now we're back to that with data center style networking in the cloud. I mean, it makes sense why they price this way, but it also sucks as a customer because my data transfer costs are higher than my compute costs most of the time. Does anyone know what it costs to move a terabyte of data in AWS? That's right, you don't, because no one does. It depends. Now, you can move data almost anywhere, but it is incredibly difficult to figure out how much it costs until you actually go ahead and do it, because it's become an economic problem. And oh no, we're all accountants now. One of the biggest things that our customers, when we talk to them, don't understand during a cost optimization engagement is their networking costs. They don't understand why their egress costs are high, why their cross-AZ transfer costs are higher than what they should be. Until you point it out, they don't realize that every gigabyte they take in from the outside world, they're moving 50 internally. There's something very strange there. It's not rocket surgery, but you have to know what you're looking for, and the entire field really doesn't right now. Run a packet capture and look at what you're seeing. Network flow logs aren't terrific, but they'll at least point at some of the easy culprits on this. See what is talking to what. These are things that most of you in this room already know how to do, which puts you in a rarefied group. These are all things you can take to a cloud-native company who will value what you're bringing to the table if you talk about it a little bit differently. Because people inherently hand-wave over the parts they don't understand until you have an in-depth conversation with them about it and they realize how much they don't know. That's where growth comes from. Yeah, the struggle is real here. Yeah, the death of the network engineer as a dedicated discipline or profession isn't here, but I can see it on the horizon. It's always going to be there because the field is shrinking. So what replaces it? That's up to you. I'm not here to tell you all how to do your jobs. You have super in-depth networking knowledge. You understand things at layers of the OSI model that most developers aren't aware exist, and that is not an exaggeration. Start meeting developers further up the stack. Don't do what a network engineer I used to work with who inspired me to learn more so I could show him up said, oh, the problem with the network, it's fine, fuck you. I heard that a lot until I learned how to actually present data appropriately, and then he would mumble and the problem would go away. Great, there are easier ways to get there. Start moving into the application space, up the stack. And if you can do that, you can become a force multiplier that these companies sorely need. If you're in an SRE team as someone who gets networking at a deep and fundamental level, that has the potential to change everything. Anyone know what that is? That's right, it's a visual representation of Kubernetes networking. It is a goddamn train wreck. It is overlays on top of overlays, and it's all done in software and implemented by people who are guessing at the best of times. It's never been more important to care about stuff like this because microservices are so highly dependent upon the network for their function. We have large decoupled systems that are communicating between them, and that becomes difficult at scale. Latency, round trip times add up, particularly when you're making a whole bunch of small requests in series. So suddenly you have compounding delays as a result. Systems engineering as a discipline is moving away from all this stuff. You can step in and you can step up. Please do it. I want this to be better for all of us. And if you're comfortable moving into coding, which is not for everyone, let me be clear here, there is a bright future for you. I mean, I did it from Linux systems admin world, and if I can do it, then I assure you, anyone you folks can do that too, because I am not a good programmer. I speak two programming languages only, brute force and enthusiasm. But when I apply them, you can get surprisingly far. Like, honestly, I used to tell people all the time that I'm not a programmer at all. And then I went back to writing a suspicious amount of YAML with weird flow control logic in there to not be an actual programmer. I remember this talk by a wonderful woman 10 years ago, and she asked, as an icebreaker, who here has written horrible code and what was it? Raise your hand and tell me what the worst code you ever written is. It's a great icebreaker, and people told stories, and then the microphone got to someone who raised his hand. He took the mic, and he says, hi, I'm Toby, and I wrote MRTG. And then he handed off the microphone, because what else is he going to say beyond that? No one's going to top it. Is it terrible? Yes. Who uses it? Everyone. I mean, I got aggressive with Perl once when I had to patch Rancid to speak to Radware load balancers, if that doesn't date me a bit. And it was some terribly written Perl, but it worked. You know, until you turn on strict or errors or warn, and suddenly the whole thing explodes. So let's not do that. Shove that mess back under the bed and not look at it. It was shitty. Does anyone here still use Rancid today? Okay, there are some hands. Good, thank God. I've not completely gotten lost in the past. Whew, it's coming. The point is that you can define yourself in a lot of different ways to express the things that you do in ways that resonate, in ways that are helpful, and in ways that benefit your own career. It comes down to basics. Be an SRE with a network focus. Be a DevOps who happens to understand networks, but please don't call it DevNetOps. I think we've stuffed enough words into one at this point. If you can understand the concepts, and I assure you that everyone here can, then the future's bright. If your value proposition is that you read Cisco documentation better than anyone else, though, you better start looking for another job, because at some point, AI is going to eat you. It's a dumbass, much like me, but it's super confident, much like me. If your value proposition instead is that I understand how networks work at a fundamental level, and I can help you build systems that are more reliable and resilient and more performant, you're not a network engineer, you're a computer scientist with a networking emphasis, and a shitload of companies need you. Because what the big companies have figured out, and some folks are waking up to as well, is that they don't necessarily need the big vendors. If you understand how BGP works, not just how to configure it in a Cisco ASR, there's always going to be a place for you in the industry. Also, please teach me how BGP works, because I'm tired of not knowing. If you're a Juniper MX configuration monkey, you're the horse buggy repair person in the automobile, just came over the top of the hill, heading right for us. You have a choice. If all you're doing is sitting around milking a skill you learned 20 years ago and doing the same thing every day, frankly, you should be an accountant. Not to besmirch accountants, but that's okay. They're not here at this conference. They're sitting at home wishing they had friends. You should be caught with a net. But if you're near retirement, for example, as well, great. Please don't let your knowledge leave the industry when you do. Please instill the next generation with an understanding of how this works, with the knowledge that you have. And that's the risk that I see. That's what I came here to talk about. Because when hyperscalers scoop up all of the folks who get it, they run the risk of cornering the market on the knowledge. And you're all too smart to let that happen. The value that this audience provides to the industry is a fundamental understanding of networking concepts, not vocational click-the-button skills. Start championing that value, please. We desperately need you, because otherwise TCP really will terminate on the floor. I'm Corey Quinn. I still have the microphone. Thank you for listening to me. You may clap now.
Let's do it for a second.
Thank you
Let's
very
see if you have any
Sure.
questions. Thanks, Corey. Do we have any questions? If we do, I'll encourage you to walk over to one of the microphones. And when you do, please remember to introduce yourself, the company you're representing, before asking your question.
And of course, what the hell's the matter with you is the most popular question I get. Feel free.
I had to squaw. There we go. Good morning, John Brown, Team Cumry, and many other things over the years. I can't agree enough with you about taking the elevator back up to the top. We as a community need to actively be supporting folks coming into this community and helping them go up and learn. I know there are people in this room today that are doing one job and would like to do a different job, or would like to learn a different job. And we should support those individuals and help them expand their view and where they could be in the ecosystem, whether it is outside plant management, it's inside the network, it is building out data centers, it is figuring out how to do proper power and cooling that's eco-friendly. There's so many different skill sets that are needed, and there's a collective brain trust in this room. Just look for the gray beard guys, and I was going to say gals too, but I don't think a gray beard would be, anyway, I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to get in trouble with an omnibudsman. But yes, we need to be doing that actively in this community. I can't stress that enough. So thank you for making that part of your talk.
I would also caution folks to remember that the roads that most of us walked are no longer open in the same way. It turns into basically boomer advice of, oh, just go and print out your resume on super nice paper and walk in with a firm handshake and ask to speak to the owner and you'll have a job by sundown. Hit the bricks. It doesn't work that way anymore. The things that I did to get into the role that I'm in, those jobs aren't there. The culture around them isn't there. So we have to find new ways of meeting people where they are, but I don't think expecting people to suddenly evolve into senior folks without guidance and help is realistic. One of the biggest problems I see in the industry. Other questions, comments, concerns, criticisms. A reading of your resume disguised as a question is ever popular as well.
Okay. Lindsay, with Xmission. This is really not necessarily a question, more just thinking out loud on top of what you said. There is, like you said, the industry has changed. The people that we have learned from has changed. Xmission, we've come from an open source Linux, sysadmin, and also a networking hybrid and that's kind of where we learn, and how we came about. But now, like you're saying, it's changing to, everything is kind of becoming overlay networks. Everything is becoming in the cloud. Where do you learn from that, and how do you explain the fundamentals, that undergird that whole new industry to the new generation? It's very difficult to find that overlap, and how do you kind of help the new generation to understand what's underpinning this whole new network and industry?
Yeah, for me, I wound up getting a CCNA during the global financial crisis because suddenly I was in a job that had no mobility and I was bored. I figured I'd start digging into the things I was hand-waving over. One of the things I hand-waved over the most is what the hell all this networking stuff was. What's a subnet mask? I don't know, but I know that if I get the numbers wrong, sometimes some things can't talk to each other, but it's probably fine. Just don't get the numbers wrong. Well, it helped. Once I found that I dug into this stuff, I became a better Linux admin by virtue of understanding what was going on the wire. It's still one of the first areas I go to troubleshoot something weird that I'm not understanding, because computers lie to you, but it takes work to get a packet capture to do that. I mean, not that it's impossible. I mean, computers are getting better at lying every day, but it takes a little bit more work.
All right, I think that's all. No remote? Okay. With that, Corey, thank you so much for your contribution. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for the microphone.